I remember those days in the suburban sprawl, where the routine life of school and home provided a comforting rhythm. The mornings were predictable, filled with the hurried clatter of breakfast dishes, the rustle of backpacks being prepared, and the soft murmur of a radio announcer forecasting the day's weather. Parents drove their children to the local elementary school, waving goodbye with a practiced cheerfulness that belied their own adult preoccupations. The school was a squat, unassuming building, brick facades and expansive windows that let in generous streams of light, making the corridors seem less daunting and more welcoming. Within this microcosm of youthful exuberance and routine, one child seemed to stand apart. Daniel. He was an unremarkable boy, quiet, with an unassuming presence that allowed him to blend seamlessly into the background. His eyes, however, told a different story. Deep and contemplative, they hinted at a world beyond the mundane. Daniel had an imaginary friend, which didn't seem all that unusual at first. Many children conjured imaginary companions, figures who occupied their minds, sharing in adventures and secrets never to be divulged to adults. Daniel's imaginary friend was named Uncle Milty. He often spoke of Uncle Milty with a fondness that made it seem as though this entity were an integral part of his life. His parents laughed it off, attributing it to a vivid imagination and perhaps a craving for attention. After all, they were often busy with work, leaving Daniel to his own devices more often than they liked. The first sign that Uncle Milty was more than just a figment of Daniel's imagination occurred during an otherwise uneventful show-and-tell session at school. Each child was expected to bring something of interest from home, a tangible link to their world outside the classroom. As Mrs. Henderson, their ever-patient teacher, called on Daniel, he padded to the front of the room with the unassuming confidence of one about to reveal a great treasure. He carried a small, nondescript box, which he placed on the teacher's desk with great care. "This is a gift from Uncle Milty," he announced, his voice steady, lacking the usual childish tremor when addressing the class. The room stirred with curiosity as Mrs. Henderson, amused by the mystery, urged him to open it. Daniel lifted the box's lid with a deliberate slowness, a magician about to reveal a trick. Inside was something that should not have been there. A severed head, real yet impossible, sat within the confines of the box. The class erupted into chaos. Screams, gasps, a chorus of disbelief. Mrs. Henderson paled, her voice faltering as she hurriedly closed the box, ushering the children away. The school called the authorities, and Daniel's parents were summoned in a flurry of confusion and fear. The incident was dismissed as an elaborate, albeit horrific, prank. An investigation was conducted, but no head was ever found. The box, upon closer inspection, was empty, leading many to suspect that it had been a macabre illusion or a collective hallucination. Yet, for those who had been in that room, the sight was seared into their consciousness, an indelible mark of something profoundly wrong. In the days that followed, Daniel became the center of an intense scrutiny, both from curious peers and worried adults. His parents were perplexed, questioned repeatedly, but unable to offer any clarity. Daniel, however, remained unchanged by the ordeal. When asked, he simply explained, Uncle Milty wanted me to share his gift. He said it would be important. Attempts to delve further into Daniel's psyche were met with a calm deflection. He spoke of Uncle Milty as though he were discussing the weather, with a straightforwardness that unnerved those attempting to unravel his truth. Psychologists were brought in, professionals who probed with clinical detachment, searching for signs of trauma or underlying issues. Each session ended with the same conclusion. Daniel was a perfectly normal child, albeit one with an unusually vivid imagination. At home, his parents tried to downplay the event, hoping the attention would fade with time. They watched him closer, though, noting any trivial change in behavior. Yet, to their bewilderment, Daniel remained steadfastly himself, an ordinary boy living in the shadow of an extraordinary event. As weeks turned into months, the memory of the severed head began to fade from the collective consciousness of the community, becoming a whispered myth rather than a reality. However, for Daniel, the presence of Uncle Milty grew stronger. He spoke to his imaginary friend more frequently, often retreating into long, silent conversations that left onlookers uneasy. The escalation was subtle, a gradual shift that went unnoticed by those preoccupied with their own lives. Daniel's demeanor became more introspective, his play more solitary. In his room, he would arrange his toys in elaborate formations, as though preparing for a role in some grand narrative, understood only by him and Uncle Milty. One evening, as autumn's chill settled over the neighborhood, Daniel's mother heard him speaking in hushed tones. She paused outside his door, listening. His words were soft, contrasting with the unsettling content of his conversation. "Yes, Uncle Milty, I understand. They can't see you, but I do. We're ready." Concerned, she knocked softly before entering. Daniel was alone, his expression serene as he turned to her with an innocent smile. "I'm talking to Uncle Milty," he explained, as though no further clarification was needed. "Would you like to tell me what you and Uncle Milty were discussing?" she asked, striving for a casual tone that masked her growing unease. "He's helping me with a new game," Daniel replied cryptically, his gaze unwavering. The climax arrived on a night when the winds howled with an unusual ferocity, shaking the trees and sending leaves skittering across the pavement like restless spirits. Daniel's parents were hosting a dinner party, a rare occasion aimed at re-establishing normalcy, an antidote to the lingering shadows of the past months. As laughter and conversation filled the house, Daniel excused himself to his room, leaving the adults to their revelries. His absence barely noted amidst the clinking of glasses and the soft strains of music. It wasn't until the lights began to flicker ominously that anyone noticed. A sudden, inexplicable coldness descended, an oppressive weight that stilled the room's chatter. The guests glanced at one another, unease spreading like a contagion. From upstairs, the sound of Daniel's voice, clear and unperturbed, drifted down, a lullaby of sorts, sung in a language none recognized. Alarmed, Daniel's mother rushed upstairs, her heart pounding with a dread she couldn't articulate. She found his room illuminated by a strange, ethereal glow, a light with no discernible source. Daniel stood in the center, his eyes closed, a serene expression on his face. "Daniel," she called, her voice tight with fear. He opened his eyes slowly, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that seemed beyond his years. "Uncle Milty was just showing me the way," he said, his tone placid, devoid of fear or uncertainty. "What way?" she pressed, her mind reeling with possibilities she dared not entertain. "The way to see what others can't," he replied, as though the answer were self-evident. Before she could respond, the glow winked out, leaving the room steeped in a darkness deeper than before. Daniel's mother stood frozen, her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. The following days were marked by an air of unreality, the world viewed through a lens of quiet dread. Daniel continued his days as though the events of that night were nothing more than a dream, a surreal interlude in the continuum of normal life. Yet, for his parents and those who had been there, the fear lingered, a constant, gnawing presence. In time, the neighborhood returned to its routines, the incident relegated to whispers shared in hushed tones. But in Daniel's house, there remained a palpable, unsettling quiet, a silence that spoke of otherworldly connections and unseen companions. Daniel still spoke of Uncle Milty, his conversations less frequent, but more profound, his eyes carrying the weight of secrets untold. His parents watched him with a vigilance born of love and fear, uncertain of what each day might bring. As the seasons changed and years passed, Daniel grew into adolescence, the memory of that peculiar time in his life fading like an old photograph. Yet, the shadow of Uncle Milty lingered, a silent witness to his journey from boyhood to adulthood. The neighborhood, in its quest for normalcy, forgot the details, remembered only the echoes of a child's strange attachment to an imaginary friend. Yet, behind closed doors, Daniel, now older, occasionally felt a presence, a gentle reminder of those days when Uncle Milty was his constant companion. Even as he moved away, starting a life of his own, he would sometimes wake in the dead of night, certain he could hear the soft, familiar whisper of Uncle Milty, reminding him of the truths seen only by those who dare to look beyond the veil of the ordinary. I remember the sound of the school bell, that familiar chime signaling the end of the day, and the swarm of eager children spilling into the hallways. It was a typical afternoon at Willow Creek Elementary School, the sun casting a warm glow through the windows as the collective noise of laughter and chatter filled the air. In those days, everything seemed so normal, so perfectly mundane, that I could hardly have imagined how quickly things would take a turn. My son, Peter, was a quiet child with a vivid imagination that often left him absorbed in worlds of his own making. He had a particular fondness for show and tell, where he could weave stories around his little treasures, much to the delight of his classmates. Peter's teacher, Mrs. Collins, had called me in for a meeting once, praising his creativity, but noting his tendency to drift into conversations about his Uncle Milty. She assumed it was a figment of his imagination, a harmless, invisible friend the children sometimes conjure. At home, Peter often spoke of Uncle Milty. To him, Uncle Milty was an eccentric character, full of whims and wisdom. He said Uncle Milty lived in the shadows, but Peter never seemed afraid. He described him as a guide of sorts, helping him find lost toys or giving advice on school projects. At first, this amused me, the way children often find comfort in their imaginary companions. But there was something in Peter's eyes, a glimmer of sincerity, that sometimes unsettled me. Life continued in its regular cadence, our routines unbroken until that peculiar morning when Peter insisted on taking a new item for show and tell. He cradled a small, nondescript box carefully wrapped in plain brown paper and declared it was a gift from Uncle Milty. I hesitated for a moment, asking what was inside, but Peter only smiled, a secretive smile that held both innocence and something I couldn't quite place. As he left for school, the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across our suburban street, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this day would be different. By noon, my phone rang. Mrs. Collins on the line, her voice quivering. She asked me to come to the school immediately. I hurried, heart pounding with each step as I braced myself for whatever awaited. The scene in the classroom was chaotic. Children huddled in groups, whispering, while Mrs. Collins stood pale and shaken. On the teacher's desk was the box Peter had taken with him, now open, its contents exposed. The room felt cold, an odd chill that didn't belong on such a sunny day. My gaze fell on Mrs. Collins, who gestured toward the box, as if unable to speak the words aloud. Inside was a head, not a real one, but a disturbingly lifelike replica. Eyes open and staring, mouth slightly agape. A prop, perhaps, from a movie set or an elaborate Halloween setup, but still grotesque enough to unsettle anyone who laid eyes on it. I felt a cold sweat prick my skin, a sense of dread creeping over me as I wondered how Peter came into possession of such a thing. Peter stood off to the side, unperturbed, as if this was all as it should be. When I asked him where he got the head, he simply said, "Uncle Milty gave it to me." His calm demeanor only heightened my distress. Mrs. Collins suggested that perhaps some older kids had played a prank on him, but deep down, I suspected something more enigmatic was at play. After a lengthy conversation with the principal, Peter was allowed to leave early, the head confiscated for investigation. As we drove home, I asked him more about Uncle Milty, but his answers remained vague, shrouded in the fanciful logic of a child. He insisted that Uncle Milty was always around, especially when it was dark, watching out for him and teaching him things. There was a sincerity in his words that both warmed and chilled me. Over the following days, I tried to learn more about this imaginary uncle. I combed through Peter's room, searching for clues. In his drawings, Uncle Milty was often depicted as a tall, shadowy figure with a wide-brimmed hat, always standing on the periphery of whatever scene Peter had sketched. I found a series of notes, simple messages scrawled out in Peter's childish hand. Uncle Milty says be careful. Uncle Milty knows secrets. Uncle Milty sees in the dark. The atmosphere in our home shifted subtly but surely. The shadows seemed to grow longer, the nights colder. Peter continued to speak of Uncle Milty with familiarity, occasionally laughing at jokes only he seemed to hear. Despite my unease, I couldn't bring myself to dismiss Peter's tales outright. They were too consistent, too real in his eyes. One evening, as I washed dishes, I heard Peter talking in his room. At first, I thought nothing of it. He often entertained himself with stories and conversations. But as I approached his door, the air felt different, charged with a static energy that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I paused, ear pressed against the wood, listening to the one-sided dialogue. Peter's voice was a soft murmur, responding to questions or prompts only he could hear. "Yes, Uncle Milty," he said. "I will tell them." There was a pause, then laughter. His giggle mixed with something deeper, a resonance that did not belong in the throat of a child. My heart skipped, fear settling in my stomach like a stone. I knocked, the sound reverberating down the corridor, and entered. Peter sat cross-legged on the carpet, toys scattered around him, but his focus was on the shadow-draped corner of the room. When I asked whom he was talking to, he grinned. "Uncle Milty." His eyes shone with an intensity that seemed far beyond his years. That night, I struggled to sleep, tossing and turning as the house creaked around me. At some point, I must have drifted off, only to be jolted awake by the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway. I lay still, listening as they paused outside my door before continuing towards Peter's room. My pulse quickened as I rose, every instinct telling me to protect my son. The hallway was dark, the only light a sliver of moonbeam filtering through a window. I moved towards Peter's room with trepidation, feeling a presence, an awareness that seemed to watch from the shadows themselves. But when I reached the door, the sensation vanished, leaving only silence and the faint sound of Peter's breathing. The following days blurred together, each one steeped in a tension that refused to dissipate. I found myself increasingly on edge, jumping at small noises and imagining figures in the corner of my vision. Peter, on the other hand, seemed untouched by the unease that gripped our home. His conversations with Uncle Milty grew more frequent, and though his demeanor remained unchanged, I sensed a growing distance, a part of him slipping into a world I couldn't reach. Desperate for answers, I decided to consult a child psychologist, hoping they might shed light on Peter's unusual attachment to his imaginary friend. The psychologist, Dr. Harris, was kind and patient, listening intently as I recounted the events. She suggested it was common for children to have imaginary friends, especially in times of stress or loneliness. "But Peter isn't lonely," I argued. "He's always been happy, content." Dr. Harris nodded, considering my words. Sometimes these figures are a way for children to process emotions they can't articulate. Perhaps Uncle Milty represents something Peter is grappling with internally. I left the office feeling no better than when I arrived. Though Dr. Harris's explanation made sense, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Uncle Milty than mere imagination. That night, as shadows danced across the walls, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. As the days wore on, my fear turned into something more tangible, an urge to confront whatever it was that had taken hold of my son. I began staying up late, determined to catch a glimpse of Uncle Milty. to prove to myself that he was nothing more than a figment of Peter's active imagination. One evening, as I wandered the darkened halls, I felt a shift, the air thickening with that familiar static charge. I stopped by Peter's room, where the door stood ajar, casting a sliver of light across the hallway floor. I peered in, my breath catching in my throat. Peter was asleep, peaceful and unaware, yet the shadows in the room seemed to pulse, coalescing in the corner by his bed. I blinked, and for a moment, I swore I saw a figure standing there, tall, with a wide-brimmed hat casting a deeper shadow over its face. Cold fear gripped me, and I stumbled back, heart racing. As quickly as it appeared, the figure dissolved into the darkness, leaving me questioning my sanity. In the days that followed, I became obsessed with uncovering the truth. I scoured the internet, searching for anything that might explain the phenomenon. My search led me down paths of folklore and urban legends, stories of shadow people and entities that feed on fear and imagination. They were tales, nothing more, yet they resonated with an uncomfortable truth I couldn't dismiss. Peter, oblivious to my growing obsession, continued his conversations with Uncle Milty, now more animated than ever. It was as if he were communicating with a trusted mentor, someone who understood him completely. I watched him, torn between the urge to intervene and the fear of pushing him further away. As the situation reached its zenith, I resolved to confront whatever force was influencing Peter. I stayed awake for nights on end, vigilant and determined, until exhaustion threatened to overtake me. On the final night, as the moon hung low and the world was draped in silence, I took a deep breath and entered Peter's room. The air was thick, the shadows deep and impenetrable. I called out, my voice trembling as I demanded to speak with Uncle Milty. There was no response, only the faint rustling of leaves outside the window. I pushed further, insisting that if he was real, he should show himself, explain his intentions. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the shadows flickered, and I felt a presence, a consciousness brushing against mine, like a whisper in the dark. It was neither hostile nor benign, simply there, observing. My legs threatened to give way under the weight of the moment, but I stood firm, refusing to yield to fear. "Please," I whispered, "leave my son alone." The shadows seemed to shift, a ripple of movement that left me breathless. I felt a pressure in my mind, not words, but an understanding that settled over me like a sudden storm. Uncle Milty was not a threat, but a guardian of sorts, drawn to children like Peter, who saw beyond the veil of reality. He had no desire to harm, only to teach, to guide. As the realization sank in, the shadows receded, leaving the room bathed in the gentle light of a new dawn. Peter stirred, waking to find me sitting at his bedside. He looked at me with sleepy eyes, unaware of the night's events, and smiled. "Did you see Uncle Milty?" he asked, his voice a soft murmur. I nodded, overwhelmed by the truth I had come to accept. "Yes," I said softly, "I did." In the weeks that followed, the tension in our home eased. Peter continued to speak of Uncle Milty, but the fear that had haunted me gradually faded. I accepted that some mysteries are beyond explanation, that the world is full of wonders and enigmas that defy logic. Yet, even as peace returned, I couldn't entirely forget the presence I had felt, the sense of being watched from the shadows. It lingered at the edges of my consciousness, a reminder that the boundary between reality and imagination is often blurred. And so, life went on, ordinary and extraordinary, in equal measure. I watched Peter grow, his imagination as vibrant as ever, knowing that Uncle Milty was never far away. Shadows became less menacing, more like old friends, always there just beyond the light, whispering secrets to those willing to listen. When I look back on it, I often wonder when I first realized that something was off about my son. On the surface, he was perfect. Tommy was the kid every parent dreamed of having, well-behaved, polite, brilliant at school, and beloved by everyone who met him. At 8 years old, his teachers gushed about his intelligence and kindness. Neighbors greeted him warmly as he walked past, always eager to lend a hand or offer a smile. Even his room was impeccably tidy, with toys arranged in neat rows and books alphabetized on the shelves. Yet, there was something about the way he held himself, an almost preternatural calmness that seemed to seep into the very air around him, creating a subtle discord that only I could sense. It was on a clear autumn afternoon when I felt the first stirrings of unease. I was washing the dishes, the sun casting golden patterns across the kitchen, while Tommy played in the backyard. Glancing out the window, I saw him standing stock still at the edge of the lawn, staring intently at something hidden from my view by the hedgerow. There was a focus to his posture, an intensity that seemed unusual for a child immersed in the world of make-believe games. I watched for a moment, expecting him to lose interest and run back to the swings or the sandbox, but he remained there, unmoving. After drying my hands, I stepped outside, the crisp scent of fall filling my lungs. Tommy didn't hear me approach, his attention riveted. "What are you looking at, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He turned slowly, his blue eyes catching the light in a way that for a split second made them look almost translucent. "Just a bird, Mom," he replied, his voice calm, too calm. I searched the shadows of the hedgerow, but saw nothing. "What kind of bird?" I pressed, curious now. "A pretty one," he said simply, and then he smiled, the kind of smile that parents treasure, wide and innocent. Yet beneath it, or perhaps within it, something flickered, something cold. The incident lingered in my mind, like a splinter under the skin I couldn't quite dislodge. As the days folded into weeks, Tommy's behavior continued to be exemplary, and gradually, I dismissed my worries as overprotective fretting. But there were moments, fleeting as the shadows that slip across a room at dusk, when a chill would prick my heart. Once in the supermarket, I caught sight of him standing by the cereal aisle, staring at a couple arguing some distance away. His expression was unreadable, yet there was a density to his gaze that seemed out of place for a child. When he noticed me watching, he waved and ran over, his cheerful demeanor returning as quickly as it had left. I didn't mention my concerns to my husband, Mark. He was busy with work, and besides, voicing my fears felt like admitting they were real. Instead, I buried them, telling myself Tommy was just an observant child, nothing more. However, deep down, I knew that whatever I had glimpsed was not imagination. Then came the night of the school play. Tommy had landed the lead role as Peter Pan, and the whole family was excited. On the evening of the performance, the school auditorium was packed, filled with the buzz of anticipation. As the lights dimmed and the curtain rose, I settled into my seat, eager to watch my son shine. And shine he did. Tommy was flawless, moving across the stage with a confidence and charisma that drew every eye. His lines delivered with perfect timing, his expressions vivid and captivating. Yet, as I watched him, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a performance at all. It was as if he had truly become someone else, someone other. The thought disturbed me, and I tried to dismiss it, focusing on the proud cheers and applause that followed each scene. The play ended with a standing ovation, and I joined the throng of parents gathered to congratulate their children. Tommy was surrounded by classmates, all of them laughing and chattering excitedly. When he saw me, he ran over, face alight with triumph. "Did you see, Mom? Wasn't it great?" he asked, eyes wide with exhilaration. I hugged him tightly, the warmth of his small body reassuring against my inexplicable disquiet. "You were wonderful," I whispered, meaning it. And for a moment, all my fears seemed absurd, banished by the simple reality of his presence. That night, after tucking Tommy into bed, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts circled, restless and unresolved. It was then that I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound, like whispering carried on the wind. I sat up, straining to listen, and realized it came from Tommy's room. Heart pounding, I tiptoed to his door, pushing it open a crack. Tommy lay in bed, eyes closed, his expression serene. Yet the murmuring continued, a low susurrus that seemed to fill the space between us. As I stood transfixed, his lips moved, shaping silent words I couldn't understand. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Finally, as if sensing my presence, he stopped, the room falling into an oppressive silence. I backed away, closing the door, my hands trembling. The next morning, I decided to confront Tommy, to ask him directly about what I had seen and heard. But when he came down for breakfast, cheerfully munching on toast, I lost my nerve. How could I accuse him of something I couldn't even articulate? Instead, I watched him closely, searching for any sign of the elusive darkness I had glimpsed the night before. Yet under the bright kitchen lights, he was just Tommy, my perfect son. The unease continued to build, weaving a silent tension into the fabric of our daily lives. I began to dread the evenings, when the shadows outside grew long and the house fell into stillness. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the trees seemed amplified, echoing the turmoil within me. I became hyper-vigilant, watching Tommy for any hint of strangeness. but he appeared blissfully unaware of my growing anxiety. Then one evening, as I was folding laundry, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the pocket of Tommy's jeans was a crumpled piece of paper covered in drawings. At first glance, they seemed like ordinary child sketches. Houses, trees, a family standing hand in hand. But as I looked closer, the details shifted, revealing something else entirely. The figures were distorted, their features twisted into grotesque masks of anguish. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches curling into grasping claws. And at the center, a pair of eyes, Tommy's eyes unmistakably, stared back at me, filled with an unfathomable depth. I tried to calm the rising panic, telling myself it was just a child's imagination. But the drawings haunted me, vivid in ways that had nothing to do with the crude lines on the page. That night, I lay awake, my mind churning over the images, their meaning eluding me like smoke through my fingers. Days passed, and the atmosphere at home grew taut, straining under the weight of unspoken fears. Mark noticed my distraction, but I brushed off his concerns, unwilling to admit the truth even to myself. Instead, I resolved to find out what was happening, to uncover the source of the shadow that seemed to hang over my son. One evening, I waited until Tommy was asleep and then crept into his room. I felt a mix of guilt and determination, knowing that I was invading his privacy, but needing answers. I searched through his drawers and shelves, careful to leave everything as I found it. At first, there was nothing, just the usual assortment of toys and books. But then I found it, tucked away in the back of his closet, a small box, its lid secured with a piece of string. My hands shook as I opened it, revealing a collection of objects that seemed innocent at first glance. Pebbles, feathers, bits of string. Yet each item was meticulously arranged, an order that spoke of a significance beyond my understanding. And there, nestled among them, was a small notebook. I opened it with trepidation, the pages filled with dense, swirling script. The words were indecipherable, but the energy they exuded was palpable, a silent hum that resonated through me. I closed the notebook, a growing dread settling in my bones. I replaced everything as I had found it, retreating to the safety of my room, where I sat, shivering in the dark, a prisoner of my own fear. What was happening to my son? And why did I feel as though something ancient and unknowable was watching, waiting in the shadows of our lives? The next morning, I knew I had to confront Tommy, no matter how difficult it would be. Over breakfast, I watched him, gathering my courage. "Tommy," I began, voice steady despite the turmoil within. "I found your drawings. Can we talk about them?" He looked up, the spoon pausing midway to his mouth, surprise flickering across his face. But then, to my astonishment, he smiled. "They're just pictures, Mom, from my dreams." "Dreams?" I echoed, caught off guard. "Yeah," he continued, as if this explained everything. "They come to me at night. I just draw them so I don't forget." There was an innocence to his explanation, yet it only deepened my unease. "Is that why you whisper at night?" I pressed, watching him closely. His smile faded, replaced by a look of genuine confusion. Whisper. I don't whisper. The sincerity in his voice left me at a loss. Had I imagined it all? Was my mind playing tricks on me, weaving patterns where none existed? But the drawings, the notebook, they were real, weren't they? I decided to confide in Mark, hoping for some clarity. That evening, after Tommy was asleep, I told him everything. My fears, the drawings, the box. He listened patiently, though I could see the skepticism in his eyes. Kids have wild imaginations, he said gently. Maybe he's just more creative than most. It's more than that, I insisted, frustration edging my voice. There's something else, something wrong. Mark sighed, wrapping an arm around me. I think you're overthinking it, love. But if it bothers you, we can talk to someone. Maybe get a professional opinion. The suggestion provided a small measure of comfort, yet it did little to quell the storm inside me. I spent the following days in a haze of anxiety, vacillating between seeking help and fearing the answers I might uncover. It was late one night when everything came to a head. I awoke to a soft creaking, the sound of footsteps in the hall. Heart pounding, I rose from bed, quietly opening the door. Tommy stood there, silhouetted in the dim light, eyes open but unseeing. Tommy? I whispered, but he didn't respond, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls of our home. He began to move, a slow, deliberate walk, as if drawn by an invisible thread. I followed, a sense of inevitability wrapping around me like a shroud. He led me to the backyard, the air cool and still, the silence deep as a well. There, in the moonlight, Tommy stopped, turning to face me. His eyes, usually so bright and cheerful, were dark pools, unfathomable and ancient. Why, Tommy? I asked, my voice a fragile thing in the night. He blinked, and for a moment, clarity seemed to return. It's okay, Mom, he said softly, as if he were the parent, soothing a child's fears. They told me everything will be fine. Who told you? I demanded, though part of me dreaded the answer. Them, he replied simply, gesturing to the shadows that stretched long and thin around us. I blinked, and the world seemed to shift, the familiar turning strange and ominous. I saw them then, shapes moving in the darkness, indistinct yet undeniably real. They hovered at the edge of my vision, whispering secrets I couldn't comprehend, a language of silence and shadows. Tommy reached out, his small hand finding mine, grounding me in the midst of the surreal. Don't worry, Mom, he said, his voice gentle and knowing. They won't hurt us. The conviction in his words offered a strange comfort, yet it did nothing to dispel the terror that gripped me. I closed my eyes, wishing for the nightmare to end, for dawn to break and banish the phantoms of the night. When I opened them again, Tommy was just a boy once more, his eyes clear and innocent. The shadows were gone, leaving only the quiet hum of the world settling back into place. I held him close, the warmth of his body a welcome balm against the lingering chill. In the aftermath, we never spoke of that night. Life resumed its normal course, the days slipping by with familiar ease. Yet beneath the surface, the unease remained, a silent undercurrent that I could never fully ignore. Tommy continued to draw, his dreams still vivid and enigmatic, but I no longer searched for meaning in them, no longer sought answers that seemed beyond my grasp. Instead, I focused on the everyday moments, finding solace in the ordinary, even as the extraordinary lingered, waiting in the wings. The fear never fully left me, a shadow that walked beside us, invisible yet ever present. But I learned to live with it, to accept the dual nature of the world we inhabited. My perfect son, with his perfect life, and the mysteries that lay just beyond the veil of understanding. In time, I came to realize that some questions are best left unanswered, that some shadows are meant to remain unseen. And so I watched and waited and loved my son, even as the darkness watched and waited too. The house was quiet, as it always was during the time when the sun began its descent beyond the horizon. It was a modest two-story home, nestled comfortably in an unassuming suburban neighborhood. The Reynolds family had lived there for over a decade, and the space had become an integral part of their lives. The walls, painted in warm hues, echoed with laughter and memories. It was a sanctuary, a place meant for safety and solace. From the outside, the house was unremarkable, like any other in the neighborhood with its neat lawn and white picket fence. Inside, however, it held a secret, one that was slowly beginning to stir from its long slumber. Tommy Reynolds was 8 years old, and like many children his age, he harbored an irrational fear of the dark. His parents, understanding but practical, had installed a nightlight in his room, its soft, comforting glow casting friendly shadows across the walls. Yet, even with its presence, Tommy found himself clutching his blanket tightly each night, his small heart thumping nervously as he peered into the inky corners of his room. It was on a particularly warm autumn evening when things began to change. The day had been unremarkable, filled with ordinary events, school homework, and a dinner of macaroni and cheese. As bedtime approached, Tommy finished brushing his teeth and reluctantly shuffled to his room. His mother, Sarah, followed behind, offering the usual bedtime assurances. "Everything's okay, sweetheart," she murmured, smoothing his hair as she tucked him in. "There's nothing in the dark that isn't there in the light." Tommy nodded, though his eyes still darted towards the closet, that yawning maw that seemed to hold secrets of its own. His mother kissed his forehead and turned off the main light, leaving only the gentle luminescence of the nightlight to hold back the darkness. Sarah left the room, pulling the door to a close with that familiar creak, leaving a small crack open as Tommy preferred. He lay there for several minutes, staring at the ceiling, trying to quiet his mind. The house was still, the only sounds the occasional creak of settling wood and the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs. It was then that the first disturbance occurred. A soft rustling, barely perceptible, drifted from the closet. Tommy's heart skipped a beat. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to think of other things, of the weekend trip to the zoo, of his favorite superhero. But the sound persisted, a gentle scritch-scratch that set his teeth on edge. "Mom," he called out. his voice barely above a whisper. But there was no response. His parents were likely engrossed in their own pursuits, assuming their son was tucked safely in the arms of sleep. Summoning his courage, Tommy sat up and peered into the dimness. The closet door was slightly ajar, though he distinctly remembered it being closed. His small hand trembled as he reached for the flashlight he kept under his pillow. Clicking it on, he shone the beam towards the source of his anxiety. The light fell upon the open closet, illuminating nothing more than clothes and toys. But the rustling stopped, as if whatever had disturbed the peace had retreated from the probing glare. Tommy exhaled slowly, convincing himself it was nothing but a trick of the mind. Yet, as he lay back down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Over the next few nights, the disturbances grew more frequent. Every evening, as the house descended into its nocturnal quietude, the sounds would begin. The rustling, now accompanied by a soft whispering, seemed to emanate from the very walls. Tommy, sleep-deprived and anxious, confided in his parents, but they dismissed his fears as childish fancy. "There are no monsters, Tommy," his father, Mark, assured him with a chuckle. "Just your imagination playing tricks on you." But Tommy knew, deep down, that something was amiss. The darkness within the house felt alive, as though it was slowly awakening from a deep, restless slumber. He began to dread the approach of night, the anxiety building into a tight knot in his stomach. The escalation came without warning. One night, as the family sat down for dinner, an unsettling chill filled the air. It was subtle at first, a cool draft snaking through the rooms, despite the windows being closed. Tommy shivered, feeling the prickle of fear along his spine. His parents exchanged a glance, both aware of the sudden change in atmosphere, but unwilling to voice it aloud. Later, as Tommy lay in bed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were incoherent, a jumble of voices overlapping, though one cut through the rest, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to resonate within the very marrow of his bones. "Tommy," it sighed, his name stretching into a susurrus that filled the room. Panicked, Tommy bolted upright, clutching his flashlight like a talisman. The beam swept across the room, landing on the closet once more. The door was wide open now, darkness pooling within its depths. For a moment he thought he saw a shape lurking there, a shadow darker than the rest, shifting and amorphous. He scrambled out of bed, running to his parents' room. His mother, groggy and half asleep, comforted him, though her patience was wearing thin. "It's just a bad dream, honey," she murmured, half convinced herself. But Tommy knew it was more than that. The house was changing, the comforting embrace of home replaced by an insidious presence that wrapped around him like a shroud. It felt as though the walls were closing in, the darkness pressing ever closer. The climax came one fateful night, a night that began like any other. The family gathered for dinner, the conversation stilted, each member acutely aware of the tension that had settled over them like a fog. Even the house seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy with anticipation. As Tommy lay in bed that night, he felt certain he would not find sleep. The whispers came again, louder than ever, filling his ears until he thought they might burst. And then, with a suddenness that took his breath away, The nightlight flickered and died, plunging the room into impenetrable darkness. Panic-stricken, Tommy fumbled for his flashlight, but it slipped from his grasp, rolling under the bed. He was alone, utterly alone, cocooned in an ebony void. The whispers ceased, replaced by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to reverberate through the floorboards. Heart pounding, Tommy knew he had to act. Driven by a primal instinct to survive, he leapt from his bed for the safety of his parents' room. But as he reached the door, it slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. He was trapped, the doorknob cold and unyielding beneath his fingers. Terror mounting, Tommy turned back to face the room. The darkness was shifting, coalescing into a form, a hulking silhouette that loomed near the closet. It was the embodiment of his nightmares, a creature born from the shadows themselves. Its eyes, pinpricks of malevolent light, fixed on him with an intensity that froze him in place. Summoning every ounce of courage, Tommy opened his mouth to scream, a soundless plea for help that echoed in the void. But before he could voice it, the shape moved, gliding across the room with an unnatural fluidity. It reached out, a tendril of darkness extending towards him. Just as the inky appendage brushed his skin, the door burst open, flooding the room with light. His parents stood there, eyes wide with fear and confusion. The creature recoiled, dissolving into shadows that slunk back into the closet, the door creaking shut behind it. Tommy collapsed into his mother's arms, trembling and sobbing. His father, shaken but resolute, approached the closet, wrenching it open to reveal nothing but clothes and toys, the ordinary trappings of a child's domain. In the days that followed, the house seemed to return to normal, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Yet, the memory lingered, a shadow on the edge of Tommy's consciousness. The whispers ceased, and the darkness no longer felt alive. But he knew that it was not gone, merely dormant. The parents, eager to restore peace, installed new, brighter lighting throughout the house, and even consulted a child psychologist, convinced that Tommy's imagination had simply run wild. But Tommy, now more aware of the thin veil between reality and the unknown, sensed that the house had secrets yet to reveal. The fear remained, lurking in the corners of his mind. He avoided the closet, never allowing it to stay open for long, the feeling that something was watching, waiting, ever present. And as night fell each day, he lay in bed with his new nightlight, a beacon against the encroaching dark, wondering if it would be enough to keep the shadows at bay. For now, the sleeping giant within the house had returned to its slumber, but Tommy understood the precariousness of peace. The darkness within might have retreated, but it was always there, a silent sentinel in the background, ready to rise once more. In the stillness of the night, as he drifted between wakefulness and dreams, Tommy occasionally heard it, a soft rustle, a breath of air. And in those moments, he knew that he was not entirely alone. The darkness a constant companion, waiting patiently for its time to come again. Every Sunday morning, in our modest suburban home, was a ritual of tranquility. As the first light of dawn filtered through the thin curtains, casting a warm glow over the room I shared with my younger brother Tommy, we would awaken to the familiar aroma of pancakes wafting through the air. It signaled a day free from the obligations of school and the routine mundanity of weekday mornings. Our house, nestled between rows of identical homes with their manicured lawns and picket fences, seemed the epitome of safety and peace. In the kitchen, Mom would hum softly to the tune of a song only she knew, flipping pancakes with a grace that came from years of practice. Dad would be at the table, hidden behind a paper, occasionally peeking over the top to watch Tommy and me as we engaged in a playful tug-of-war over the syrup bottle. It was a scene so ordinary that it never occurred to me how fragile it was, how easily the veneer of normalcy could be shattered. The first disturbance came on a night that seemed no different from any other. It was a Tuesday, and the evening had unfolded in the usual way. After dinner, we retreated to our room, where the soft hum of the house settling surrounded us. Tommy sat cross-legged on his bed, engrossed in a book about dinosaurs, his brows knitted in concentration. I lay on my bed, lost in the imaginary worlds of my own paperback. The clock ticked methodically as I drifted toward sleep, the gentle rhythm pulling me into its embrace. But then, a sound broke through the familiar cadence of the night, a soft scratching, like fingernails brushing against wood. I froze, my heart skipping a beat, straining to listen. The noise seemed to originate from the closet, an innocuous part of our room that had always been a reservoir for clothes and forgotten toys. I glanced over at Tommy, who appeared oblivious, still immersed in his book. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the oppressive silence that followed the mysterious sound. He looked up, eyes wide with innocent curiosity. "Hear what?" "The scratching from the closet." Tommy's gaze flickered to the closet door, then back to me. He shrugged, feigning nonchalance, but I noticed the way his fingers tightened around the edge of the page he had been about to turn. "Probably just a rat," he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. We both knew there were no rats in our house. Pest control had been Dad's obsession the previous summer, and the place was sealed tighter than Fort Knox. Trying to shake off the unease, I suggested we listen to music, a distraction that allowed us to drift back into the arms of sleep. The following days were a haze of school routines and homework assignments, the incident almost forgotten. But each night, as darkness enveloped our room, the scratching returned, more insistent and persistent. It became a nightly ritual, the sound growing in intensity, a constant reminder that something was amiss. It was as if the closet itself had developed a pulse, breathing and living in the shadows. Tommy grew quieter, his laughter less frequent, his eyes shadowed with something unspoken. I noticed the way he would hesitate before entering our room, the slight flinch whenever the closet creaked open to reveal its mundane contents. I, too, felt the weight of it pressing against my mind, a presence I couldn't explain, but felt with every fiber of my being. Then came the night when everything changed. It was a Friday, and our parents had decided to indulge in a rare outing, leaving us in the care of a neighbor. Mrs. Callahan was kind, but oblivious, her attention more on her knitting than on us. We were left to our own devices, and as the hours ticked by, the sense of unease grew, festering like a wound that refused to heal. We sat on Tommy's bed, the book forgotten between us. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The air seemed heavier, charged with an energy that vibrated through the room. I could see the fear in Tommy's eyes, a reflection of my own. "It's getting louder," he whispered, his voice trembling. I nodded, unsure of what to say. The scratching had transformed into more than just noise. It was a presence, palpable and sinister. The thought of opening the closet terrified me, yet the compulsion to confront whatever lay within was overwhelming. "Maybe we should tell Mom and Dad," I suggested, though I already knew what their response would be. A gentle dismissal, attributing our fears to overactive imaginations. Tommy shook his head. "They won't believe us." Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, and then, as if sensing our fear, the scratching intensified, a frantic clawing that resonated through the room. We recoiled, instinctively huddling closer together, our gazes fixed on the closet door. Suddenly, there was a soft click, barely audible over the sound of our own breathing. The closet door creaked open, inch by inch, revealing nothing but darkness within. I could feel the cold tendrils of fear wrap around my heart, squeezing until it was hard to breathe. "Close it," Tommy urged, his voice high-pitched and urgent. I moved, despite the terror that paralyzed my limbs, reaching out with a trembling hand to push the door shut. As I did, the scratching stopped abruptly, leaving a silence more chilling than the noise itself. We stayed up late that night, sleep eluding us, haunted by the specter of the unknown. When dawn finally broke, the room seemed less threatening, the morning light dispelling some of the shadows that lingered in the corners. But the sense of dread persisted, following us like a shadow we couldn't shake. Each night became a test of endurance, and I found myself growing more protective of Tommy, fearing for him more than for myself. The scratching continued, relentless and tormenting, a whisper in the dark that promised something terrible. And then, the climax of our ordeal came, swift and merciless. It was a windy night, the gusts howling through the trees outside, rattling the windows with a ferocity that matched the storm within our hearts. We lay in bed, the tension between us as taut as a drawn bowstring, waiting for the inevitable. The scratching began, louder than ever, a cacophony that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the closet. Tommy whimpered, clutching at my arm, and I pulled him closer, desperate to protect him from whatever horror lay in wait. And then it happened. The closet door burst open with a force that sent it crashing against the wall, and from the depths of that impenetrable darkness, something emerged. I couldn't see it, not really, but I felt its presence, cold and malevolent, filling the room with a primal fear. Tommy screamed, a sound that pierced my heart, and I watched in horror as he was drawn towards the closet, an invisible force pulling him inch by inch. I lunged forward, grabbing him with all my strength, but it was like trying to hold on to smoke. My grip faltered, and he slipped from my grasp, disappearing into the shadows with a final, terrified cry. The door slammed shut, and the room was plunged into silence, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I was alone, the reality of it hitting me like a physical blow. Tommy was gone, swallowed by the darkness, leaving nothing behind but the echo of his voice. I stumbled back to my bed, numb and disoriented, my mind refusing to process what had just happened. The closet stood silent and closed, no sign of the terror it had just unleashed. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the words wouldn't come, locked inside by the fear that gripped my heart. When morning came, it brought with it no relief, only an emptiness that filled every corner of the room. I sat there, staring at the closet, willing it to open and return my brother to me. But the door remained stubbornly closed, as if mocking my desperation. Our parents returned home, their smiles fading into confusion, and then horror as they realized Tommy was missing. The police were called, neighbors questioned, but there was no trace of him, no sign of the struggle that had unfolded in our room. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist, erased by the malevolent force that lurked within the closet. Days turned to weeks, and the world moved on, but the shadow of fear lingered, a constant presence in my life. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in that room again, not with the knowledge of what lay within the closet. I was haunted by the memory of Tommy's last, terrified scream, a sound that played on a loop in my mind. I told no one of what had happened that night, afraid of the disbelief I would encounter, the accusations of madness. Instead, I kept it locked away, a secret I carried alone, the weight of it pressing down on me with every passing day. But the fear never left me, an insidious whisper that followed me wherever I went. I would catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision, feel the cold touch of phantom fingers on my skin. And at night, when the darkness closed in, I would hear the scratching, a distant echo of the terror that had stolen my brother away. I grew older, but the memory of that night never faded, etched into my mind with a clarity that refused to dull with time. I avoided closets, unable to face the darkness within, and I never returned to that house, leaving it behind like a ghost of a past I couldn't escape. And yet, even now, the fear remains, a constant reminder of the sinister entity that had come for Tommy. It lurks in the shadows, waiting and watching, a presence that cannot be vanquished or forgotten. I live with the knowledge that the closet monster is real, a truth I wish I could disbelieve, but cannot deny. In the quiet of the night, when the world is at rest, I sometimes hear it, the soft, insistent scratching, a promise of the dark things that dwell just beyond the edge of the light. I know it waits for me, patient and unyielding, and I cannot help but wonder if one day it will come for me too.